27, stop buying bleach. This $1 Amish powder cleans everything, and Big Chemical hates it. A white jar sits on the kitchen shelf. You've probably walked past something like it 100 times. The powder inside looks plain, almost like flour gone wrong. But this morning, it's being stirred into a bucket of warm water, slow and steady, until the water turns cloudy and quiet. $1. That's all it takes to fill it again. Most people reach under the sink for bleach without thinking. Sharp smell, fast burn, loud proof of clean. But this doesn't behave like that at all. And there's a reason an old neighbor once told me, if it stings your nose, it's not the only way. What nobody explains is why something this simple ever disappeared from ordinary homes in the first place, or why it still works on stains bleach struggles with. That's where this gets interesting. There's a certain kind of person who's going to understand this without much convincing. They've kept things running longer than they were supposed to, fixed instead of replaced, used what was already on the shelf before buying something new. If that sounds like you, speak up in the comments. Not as an expert, just as someone who's lived it. And if you want more of these quiet, forgotten household methods, stay close. The next one comes straight from an old kitchen trick that can pull grease out of cast iron like it never had a chance to settle. The jar hasn't changed position in years. Same shelf, same corner of the kitchen where the morning light lands first. You notice it before anything else when the house is quiet enough. White powder inside, no brand, no label that matters anymore. Just a strip of tape across the glass that reads, "For everything." It doesn't look valuable. That's the strange part. Most things that save money usually don't look like anything at all. A hand reaches for it, slow, certain. The kind of hand that has worked wood, fixed fences, stirred more buckets than it can remember. No hesitation. Just a spoon into the powder, like it's been done 1,000 times before. Most people would call it dust. Most people would be wrong. Because what it gets poured into next is already waiting by the sink. A bucket of warm water, steam rising just enough to catch the light, cloth beside it, old, worn at the edges, and for a moment nothing happens. Just stirring. That's where the first question lands. Why does something this plain feel like it belongs more than anything under the sink? Bleach sits there in its bottle like it owns the space. Loud label, sharp promise. You can smell it before you even twist the cap. But this jar, it doesn't announce itself. It just waits. There's a kind of frustration that builds in homes like this over the years. Not loud frustration, quiet. The kind that shows up when you realize every bottle you buy seems more expensive than the last, but the jobs never change. Counters still get dirty, clothes still stain, floors still collect the same dust they always have. And somewhere along the line, the cleaning aisle doubled in size, but nothing actually got simpler. That's the first tension most people don't talk about. Not that things don't work anymore, but that everything feels like it costs more than it should. This is where the jar becomes interesting, because nobody keeps something like this on a shelf unless it kept proving itself. Not once, not twice, but over and over again quietly without needing attention. And yet most homes stopped using it. Why? That question sits there longer than it should, almost uncomfortable. There's a belief most people carry without realizing it. That newer means better. That stronger smell means cleaner. That harsher chemical means more serious work is getting done. But I remember an older neighbor saying something different. Not as advice, just observation. Standing by a fence post, wiping his hands on his pants like the job had already been decided long ago, he said, "The strong stuff doesn't always mean it's the right stuff." At the time, it didn't mean much. Now it does. Because what's in this jar doesn't behave like anything you'd expect from a cleaner. No sharp smell, no warning label, shouting for attention. Just a powder that disappears into water like it's supposed to be there. And still it works. Not in a dramatic way, not in a flashy way, in a steady way. The kind of steady that doesn't need to be repeated twice. There's another question building underneath all this, though. One that sits just out of reach. If something this simple can handle everyday mess, why did most homes replace it with something harsher, louder, and more expensive? That's not answered quickly. It can't be. Because before that gets clear, you have to look at what people got used to instead. And that usually starts under the sink, where the bottle with the strongest smell always seems to win, even when it probably shouldn't. And once you start noticing that pattern, it becomes harder to ignore what else might have been replaced without anyone really asking for it. The answer to what this powder is closer than it looks. The answer to what this powder is closer than it looks. Because if you kneel down right now and open the cabinet under most kitchen sinks, you'll see the real story of modern cleaning sitting there in plastic bottles, some half used, some bought twice because the first one didn't feel strong enough, a smell that hits before anything else, sharp enough to clear a room. And for most people, that smell has come to mean one thing: clean. But that belief didn't come from nowhere. It was taught slowly over years. Advertisements, habits, convenience, a kind of quiet training that told every household the same thing. If it doesn't burn your nose a little, it isn't doing real work. And that's where the first distortion begins. Bleach feels like certainty in a bottle. You pour it, and something changes immediately. The air shifts, the stain fades, the surface looks officially cleaned. There's a psychological satisfaction in that instant reaction. It makes the job feel finished before your hands are even dry. But certainty can be misleading, because not every surface needs force, not every stain needs aggression, and not every smell of clean actually means something was improved long term. There's a kind of dependency that builds without people noticing. You start using it for everything: bathroom tiles, kitchen counters, outdoor buckets, even things that never needed it in the first place. It becomes the default answer, not because it's always right, but because it feels like action. I remember a neighbor who worked maintenance most of his life. The kind of man who always had a rag in his back pocket and calluses that told stories before he did. He didn't talk much about products, but I once watched him rinse out a bucket after a job and shake his head. People think stronger smell means cleaner work, he said, not looking up. But it just means you're noticing it more. He didn't say it like wisdom, just fact. Like something he had seen too many times to argue with anymore. And that's where another question starts to form. What if part of what we associate with cleanliness is just intensity? Not effectiveness, but sensation. Because bleach doesn't just clean. It announces itself. It demands attention. It marks a space as done in a way that quieter methods don't. That creates a kind of emotional loop. The stronger the smell, the more confident the result feels. So over time, anything weaker starts to feel inadequate, even if it's doing the same job more gently. And that's how habits lock in. Kitchen routines become tied to it. Bathroom routines, laundry routines, even outdoor cleaning begins to default toward the same bottle. Not because it's always necessary, but because it's familiar. But there's something most people never really get told in a clear way. Bleach is powerful, yes, it has real uses. Sanitizing certain surfaces, handling specific situations where disinfection matters more than anything else. No honest person can ignore that. The problem isn't its existence, it's its overuse. And overuse always leaves a trail, worn surfaces. Strong lingering smell that doesn't always mean clean, just treated. And in some cases, unnecessary exposure to harsher chemicals where simpler cleaning would have been enough. That's where older households start to feel different in memory. Not because they avoided cleanliness, but because they didn't chase intensity as proof of it. They had what people sometimes called neutral cleaners, not dramatic, not loud, just steady tools for steady work, things you could use across multiple jobs without feeling like you were bringing in a chemical response every time a spill happened. And in those homes, especially rural kitchens, older barns, places where things were repaired more than replaced, there was usually one simple powder that handled far more than it looked like it should. Nothing special on the outside, just white, plain, forgettable, the kind of thing you wouldn't think twice about if you saw it on a shelf. But once it meets water, it stops being forgettable. And that's where this starts to shift from habit into method. It usually starts in a bucket you didn't think much about, warm water, a cloth, a corner of the kitchen that's been lived in long enough to carry small stains no one notices anymore. The kind that don't feel urgent, just present. And then that same plain white powder goes in again. No ceremony, no hesitation. It dissolves slower than bleach. Not dramatic, not fast. Just steady, like it's settling into the water instead of attacking it. And that difference matters more than it first appears. Because what people are really looking at here isn't a replacement for anything. It's a different approach entirely. Older homes didn't always separate cleaning into categories the way modern aisles do. Degreaser here, disinfectant there. Specialty solution for every small problem. They worked with what they had. One or two dependable mixtures, used in different ways, not different products. This powder, what many traditional households would have recognized in some form depending on region, belongs to that older, Mindset, not branded, not packaged as a miracle, just chemistry that stayed simple because life demanded it. You stir it into water and watch the change, not explosive, not instant, but you notice the way grease loosens differently, the way dried residue on a stove edge starts to lift after a patient wipe, the way laundry that has sat too long in a bucket starts to feel less heavy, less locked in. It doesn't feel like force, it feels like release. And that's the key difference most people miss when they compare it to bleach. Bleach works by overwhelming, this works by loosening. One feels like control, the other feels like patience. Now, to be clear, this is where honesty matters more than enthusiasm. This powder is not a miracle. It won't sterilize every surface the way a disinfectant is designed to. It won't replace proper sanitation in situations where that level of cleaning is actually required. And anyone pretending otherwise is selling a story, not a method. But for everyday work, kitchen buildup, laundry soaking, general grime that accumulates in real homes, it has a steadiness that surprises people who've only known stronger chemicals. There's a cost angle here too, and it's hard to ignore. A small container of this kind of powder, depending on where you get it or how it's mixed from basic household ingredients, can stretch across multiple cleaning jobs for what feels like pennies per use. Not because it's magical, because it's simple. No branding layered into the price, no packaging built to justify itself on a shelf, just material doing its job. I've seen people underestimate that at first. They expect something cheap to feel weak, and sometimes they keep using stronger bottles out of habit alone, not because they failed, but because they didn't feel finished enough. That's where perception becomes the real competitor. There's also something quieter that happens when you use it consistently. The rhythm of cleaning changes. You stop reaching for different bottles for every small task. You stop thinking in terms of what product fixes this and start thinking in terms of what actually needs to be removed here. That shift sounds small. It isn't. Because once you stop solving every problem with a different label, the house starts to feel simpler to maintain. Not because the work disappears, but because the decisions disappear. And decisions are what wear people down over time. I remember seeing this in older rural homes, places where nothing matched, but everything worked. A bucket might have served 5 different purposes in a week. A cloth wasn't designated by room. A single powder or soap or homemade mix would move through the house quietly, doing what was needed without ever asking for attention. Not because they rejected modern life, but because they didn't multiply problems unnecessarily. Still, there's an honest edge here that shouldn't be ignored. This kind of method doesn't cover everything. There are moments where bleach or stronger disinfectants still belong in the house, illness, certain sanitation needs, situations where removal alone isn't enough and killing bacteria becomes the priority. That line matters, and any real household method has to respect it. But what gets lost in modern routines is the middle ground, the everyday cleaning that doesn't need intensity, the in-between work that fills most of a normal week. That's where this powder quietly lives. Not as a hero, just as a tool that stayed simple when everything else got complicated. And once you see it that way, the next question becomes harder to ignore. Not what it does, but why something this steady ever got pushed to the edge of the shelf in the first place. That question doesn't leave quickly. Why something this steady ever got pushed to the edge of the shelf in the first place? Because nothing about it feels obsolete when you actually use it. If anything, it feels familiar in a way modern routines don't. Like something your hands already understood before anyone explained it. The bucket sits half full now, clouded water still, cloth draped over the sink edge. Nothing dramatic has happened, no flash, no moment where the house suddenly feels new. And that's the point most people miss when they chase stronger products. Not every kind of clean announces itself. Some of it just removes what didn't need to stay. There's a quiet philosophy inside older homes that rarely gets spoken out loud. Not because it was secret, but because it was obvious. You didn't replace something unless it stopped working. And you didn't complicate something unless it truly needed complication. A grandfather once showed me that without turning it into advice. Just watching him work in a shed, wiping down tools that had been in use longer than most store aisles have existed. He didn't reach for anything special, just water, cloth, and whatever simple mix was already nearby. He had a way of doing things once, not twice. That stayed with me more than anything he said, because modern life tends to double everything. Double products, double steps, double confirmation. more bottles under the sink than jobs on the list, and somehow the house still doesn't feel any easier to maintain. That's where the real shift happens with something like this powder. Not in what it replaces, but in what it removes from your thinking. When every job needs a different bottle, every mess becomes a decision, and decisions stack up faster than dirt ever does. But when one simple method covers most of the ordinary work, the house stops asking as many questions back. There's still honesty needed here, though. This isn't about rejecting everything modern. That would be foolish, and no one living in a real home can pretend otherwise. There are still times when stronger disinfectants matter, when bleach has its place, when sanitation isn't optional and speed matters more than tradition. But those moments are smaller than most people think. Most of life in a home isn't crisis, it's maintenance, quiet repetition, the same counters, the same laundry, the same small messes that never make headlines but always fill the week. That's where simplicity earns its value. And once you feel that difference, it changes how you look at what's sitting under your sink. Not with anger, not even with rejection, just awareness. Because it becomes harder to ignore how much of what you buy is built around solving problems you didn't actually have in the first place. There's a reason older rural homes felt lighter in some way, even when they were harder physically. Less clutter in thinking, fewer categories to manage, fewer choices standing between you and a clean surface. A sink didn't have five solutions nearby. It had one or two dependable ones, and those had to be enough. That kind of constraint creates a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence of having everything available, but the confidence of knowing you don't need everything available. And that's where this powder fits, not as a discovery, but as a reminder that a lot of what we call necessary today is actually just habit wearing the clothes of necessity. So when someone stirs it into a bucket and goes back to wiping a counter or soaking a load of laundry, nothing dramatic changes in the room. But something quieter does. The work feels less complicated than it used to. And that might be the real reason it survived in memory longer than it survived in stores. Not because it was hidden, but because it was simple enough to be forgotten. If you've got a way of keeping your home steady without overcomplicating it, that's worth hearing about, not in theory. In practice, what actually works in your hands when the day gets long. Share that. And if there's one thing worth carrying forward from these older ways, that's not just the powder or the method or even the cost. It's the idea that a home doesn't need more answers. It needs fewer, better ones. Next time, there's another quiet thing sitting in a kitchen cupboard that most people overlook completely. Yet it has been cutting through baked-on grease for longer than most modern cleaners have existed, and it does it without asking for much at all.